Is cheap really cheerful, or is it a race to the bottom? Sometimes I kind of regret buying home brand peanut butter or cheap sunnies off the internet. So maybe it's better to call these two cars affordable, given they're both 7-seaters, sitting squarely at the most budget-friendly end of the SUV market. The Chery Tiggo 8 Pro Max from China and the Mahindra XUV700 from India are both relatively new to Australia, so you might not be super familiar with them. They both promise long lists of features for not much financial outlay, but does saving money at the purchase lead to buyer's remorse later on? Watch on and you'll find out, because I've compared the pros and cons of these two cars to find out if either, or maybe neither, is right for you. Both of these cars are stacked when it comes to features, and both sit at around the 40k mark. Check out the full review at carsguide.com.au for the full list of specs, but for example, both of these cars come with things like keyless entry, 19-inch alloys, LED headlights, and a bunch of safety kit as well. They both have dual digital screens inside with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto phone mirroring, as well as wireless phone charging, premium sound systems, surround view cameras for parking, and synthetic leather seats. The Mahindra wins on price at $39,990 before on roads. In this case, it's the XUV700AX7L. It's got a panoramic sunroof plus a 12-speaker premium sound system, which has 4 more speakers than the Chery. The Chery's a $43,990 ask. In this case, it's the Tiggo 8 Pro Max Elite, but it wins on having more features with heated and vented front seats, interior ambient lighting, a power tailgate, sat-nav, and drive mode selection. It's also important to note that its phone mirroring is wireless, so you don't need to bring a cable like you do in the Mahindra. One of these cars looks about right for its price point in terms of design, while the other one is very clearly aiming for a more premium market look. That's right, the Chery is dressed to impress with, despite what I reckon is a bit of an inoffensive, safe look, a lot of design elements that are clearly aimed at premium market buyers. Things like the diamonds in the grille here, the LED headlight signatures, and that increasingly popular taillight at the back end that spans the width of the car. But I reckon it's inside the Chery Tiggo 8 that is probably going to win hearts in the showroom. You'd be forgiven for thinking you were in a last generation Mercedes if it had been a while since you sat in one. The start button, the shifter, the window controls, even the speaker covers are all very Stuttgart. But the interior of the Chery here is a pretty inviting cabin, save for a few cheaper materials and some hard plastics like this tacky sort of fake wood grain up here as well. The seats in here are pretty ergonomic, adjustable, they're pretty comfy actually. I like them better than the seats in the Mahindra in fact. And the steering wheel, everything in terms of the surfaces, that sort of synthetic leather, feels okay, it doesn't feel too hard and too cheap. Storage in the Chery is pretty good. This little storage bin here is actually huge. It's really deep and really wide. The passenger one is a little bit smaller than the Mahindra's one, but the water bottle door card holder is a little bit of a squeeze. I can't quite sit it in there without having to sort of force it in a bit. Fortunately, this bottle holder here fits it just about perfectly. The technology in here is where things start to go a little bit awry for the Chery. The phone charger, for example, the wireless one, is fine. It doesn't need to be plugged in for Android Auto or Apple CarPlay, but my phone does disconnect from it quite regularly, so I need to reconnect my phone to Android Auto quite often. The screens themselves have a lot of odd little things about them. There's some menus that don't seem quite right, and it's a little bit hard to navigate while you're driving. As well, the climate controls are physical in some ways. There is a little panel here with some sort of hard surfaces that are supposed to be able to be controlled by touching them, but you do need to kind of hit them twice occasionally. They're not quite as responsive as they should be. It's worth mentioning that when we picked up the cars for this comparison, another CarsGuide journalist was driving the Chery here, and the screens turned off some of the way through their drive, reset, and then the startup sequence happened, which takes a little while. It's a little musical thing that happens when you turn the car on. And they were driving without all of their information, their speed, for quite some time, and even though I haven't seen it happen myself before, it seems like a little bit of a dangerous thing that should probably be sorted out before the cars go out to customers. For the price point, the second row in the Chery feels pretty premium as well. There's a lot of soft touch materials, the seats are pretty comfy, they're also adjustable to a fairly comfortable extent. I can lean back quite a bit, although you wouldn't want to be doing that if there was someone in the row behind you. I'll get to that later. The headrests are pretty decent. They're a bit firm, but that's okay. You've got a USB-A and a USB-C port here and individually adjustable vents for the rear passengers as well. Plus, there is an armrest with a couple of bottle holders as well that pretty comfortably fit this water bottle. The door card here doesn't, the one that's kind of taken up by a little bit of space with that Sony speaker just there. I'm going to do the same thing I'm going to do in that car, and I'm going to climb into the back seat here though, so wish me luck. I'm sitting in the seat that is the one that folds up. For that to happen though, it takes a little bit of a pull here, and it doesn't give you heaps of space. So climbing over here, someone who's about 5'11", and trying to nudge myself into the back seat here. I can see that I'm not going to have a lot of leg room, but there is a decent amount of headroom back here. I'll see you back here. It's pretty much as I thought it would be back here. I have a little bit of headroom, not heaps, but it's just enough. This seat actually also reclines a bit, so I can lean back if I need to. My knees are pressed into the seat in front of me, but the second row is actually adjustable backwards and forwards, and this seat is currently in a relatively upright, but its rearmost position, which means if there was someone sitting in the seat behind you and you were in the second row, you could move your seat forwards and give them a little bit more space. There's vents for each side back here, plus a fan speed control as well. There's also a light here. I'm not sure what for, unless you were going to read sideways. And you can also see from back here that the top tether seats for both, all three of the second row seats are here as well. There's also some carpeted surfaces back here rather than just the entirety of it being scratchy plastics, which is kind of nice. It's a little bit different to the Mahindra, which is very plastic in the third row. Plus these seats are probably just slightly more comfy, but we'll jump in the Mahindra and have a look at that as well. I'm not trying to be mean when I say that the Mahindra has a little bit of a mid-2010s vibe, because I actually think that it's a design that won't age badly at all. It doesn't really follow trends and things like that, so it's got a little bit of a more traditional approach to design, but I think it's pretty good, if maybe a little bit inoffensive. These C-shaped LED headlights, though, are giving me a little bit of France. Know what I mean? Getting in here after being in the Chery feels a little bit lackluster, unfortunately, but reconsider the fact that this is still a sub $40,000 car, and suddenly a mid-size SUV with 7 seats, synthetic leather, and a sunroof is feeling pretty good. Unfortunately, there are still some surfaces in here that feel a little bit cheap, and the styling is maybe starting to get a little bit outdated already. Things like the climate controls here, the vents above it, some of the area around the shifter here, and there are a lot of hard, scratchy plastics. Even the ones that look a little bit like leather are just kind of a bit too hard. But when you put your elbows here to rest and hold the steering wheel, all the surfaces feel nice, so everything that's functional kind of works pretty well. I mentioned the climate controls, but in honesty, it is actually pretty good that they're physical controls rather than being screen-bound like a lot of functions tend to be these days. It's becoming a little bit more of a common practice, but the Mahindra has decided to go with having actual controls that you can touch. You don't need to go through a screen. It's really good. It's a convenient way to do it, and even if it looks a bit old, I think I still prefer it. The graphics on the multimedia are a little bit outdated, and it's not super obvious where some of the menu sections are. Similar thing with the driver display. It can be a little bit slow to use, but there are still some clear physical buttons on the steering wheel, which is a plus. If you want to bypass that multimedia native system, make sure you bring a cable though, because Android Auto and Apple CarPlay are both wired in this car. The seats in here aren't as comfy as they are in the Chery, but the driver's seat is electrically adjustable, and the synthetic leather trim doesn't feel too cheap or hard or nasty. Storage in here is also an interesting situation. There's a door card water bottle holder that will hold this water bottle, but these won't. So I reckon if you wanted to use these for anything, it would probably be something like a coffee cup or maybe a small drink bottle. The other thing is that the wireless phone charger here is pretty well placed. There's plenty of space here in this glove box here. It's an odd shape, but this little storage space here is pretty small compared to that in the Chery. It's a similar story in the second row with things like the scratchy plastics, although again, most of the surfaces you're really going to be touching a lot have at least got a little bit of a soft point. Some gloss black sort of piano plastic in here. Doesn't quite fit the vibe, I think, but it does have the same door card water bottle holder that fits this bottle again, and actually the armrest cup holder fits it better than it does in the front. It's also got another little storage spot down here for something small, document holder here, an odd little spot here you could sit a phone while it's charging from this USB-C port here, and there's some vents here that you can control from the back seat as well, although you don't actually have a vent adjustment. The Mahindra's second row, however, does have an adjustable seat that you can lay back in, and it's actually pretty comfy, although this does actually sort of sit up at an odd angle, so if you have got a drink in there, it might spill. Big plus about the Mahindra is that the curbside seat does actually fold really easily like that, which gives you quite a big space to step in, even as an adult. Although now I'm going to find myself probably fairly restricted back here. Amenities are pretty slim back here, but I do have my own little 12-volt plug here. There's an adjustment for the fan speed, and each side gets their own adjustable vent as well. My knee room is actually okay. I can kind of move them back and forward a little bit. I don't feel like I'm pressed into the seat in front of me, even though that one is currently at its most forward upright setting. I have a headrest behind me, which is pretty good, although if I needed to rest my head against it, I'd have to slide down in the seat a bit because my headroom is a little bit compromised back here. I'm 5'11" and my head is pretty much touching the roof, which means if there was a bump, I'd be straight into the roof. There's a water bottle holder here too. That's actually the perfect size for this bottle, which is quite a good thing. Last thing, I mentioned scratchy plastics before. It's pretty much entirely that back here. There's no soft surfaces to lean on, no armrest, and nothing gentle to put your arm on, so this is definitely not a space for long trips. Both of these being 3-row 7-seat SUVs means that once the third row is up, there's not going to be heaps of luggage space behind that in the boot. But I wanted to give you a bit of a visualization because while Chery claims that behind the third row, that's also an electric tailgate by the way, behind the third row is 117 litres of boot space. It's enough to fit this bit of luggage here. The Mahindra doesn't have a figure, but we did do a little bit of physical testing, and that same bag does actually fit in there, so it's probably not too far off. Both these SUVs have turbocharged 2-litre 4-cylinder petrol engines under the bonnet that power the front wheels, and that's all pretty standard these days, but there's a couple of things about each of them that make them quite unique to live with. For example, the Tiggo 8 has a more powerful 180 kilowatt, 375 Newton meter engine that powers the front wheels via a 7-speed dual clutch transmission. The Mahindra, on the other hand, has a little bit more torque but less power, 149 kilowatts and 380 Newton meters, and it's got a more traditional torque converter 6-speed automatic. I'll talk about the differences between those two on the road, but the Mahindra's a little bit more no-nonsense, get the job done than the Tiggo 8 is. All right, it's time to get out of the rain. All right, let's start with the Chery. There's been a lot said about the driving experience of some of Chery's cars, and a lot of the early complaints that people had have been addressed, but there are still some frustrations even with this, the Tiggo 8 Pro Max. For example, it's not as comfortable as it could be. There's some unsettled ride that's sort of quite regularly noticeable, and the suspension feels just a little bit stiffly sprung. You might also be able to hear some road noise that's kind of a constant in this car. It's also a little bit jolty at low speeds thanks to its dual clutch gearbox, which sort of feels a little bit like an odd choice for a family car. A traditional torque converter auto would be smoother and a decent enough choice in a car that doesn't really need sporty shifting. But it's the mid-cornering, especially at high speeds, which has me feeling really unconvinced about what's underneath the Chery Tiggo 8 Pro Max. On a lot of our rural test route, some of those high-speed corners with maybe some rough surfaces or even just little bits of loose gravel made it feel really unsettled and like it wasn't quite as composed as it should be. Despite its steering and its suspension feeling a little bit like it's trying to be a bit more sporty than it actually is, it just doesn't feel quite as composed and planted as it should at high speeds, windy roads, rough surfaces, and during cornering. Its steering feels nicely weighted and feels like it should be more sharp than it is, but in reality it's a little bit vague. It's not quite as dialed into the front wheels as it feels like it is. It does have a pretty powerful engine though. That 180 kilowatts does plenty when it comes to acceleration, but it also can sometimes overpower the front wheels a bit. There's an all-wheel drive version of the Tiggo 8 Pro Max, and I think that's probably the one you want to get if you're really worried about driving in the wet or on rough surfaces a lot. As you can see, today it's raining, and especially on the way out of roundabouts, I found the front wheels wanting to spin just a little bit, plus there's also a little bit of torque steer on our drive loop, even in the dry. And then there's the elephant in the room, the safety systems. If you've seen a review of the Chery Omoda 5, the car that brand launched with in Australia not too long ago, even our own review here at CarsGuide, we criticised the lane keep assist for feeling unsafe. Its steering wheel feedback kept interrupting the driver, and it felt like it was trying to move you out of the lane. It's no longer like that. It's still a little bit annoying, but it feels a lot safer than it did before. In fact, I've been using it a little bit in this car, and I did find myself turning it off after a while because it just wants to sit you a little bit too far to the left of the lane. It just needs some slightly better calibration, but the system's almost there. It is something though that for me, if I was on a long drive or someone who was taking road trips regularly, would probably be a deal breaker for me with this car. If Chery manages to calibrate it so that the steering wheel doesn't try and bump you every 3 or 4 seconds to move the steering wheel and let it take over and put you back towards the left side of the lane, I think it would actually be a pretty decent system. But, it's one of those things where this car has all those safety systems, but if one of them's really annoying and makes you want to turn it off, what's the point of having it in the first place? It's a bit of a flipped script with the XUV700. It's not super impressive when it's stationary, but once you get rolling, it's kind of punching above its weight a little bit. It's not as powerful as the Tiggo 8 Pro Max, but what it does do with its power is put it down smoothly onto the road. That 6-speed auto is actually really, really well tuned, and it doesn't ever feel like it's working too hard. In fact, I'd say sometimes it probably feels like it's a little bit too docile. But it never really feels like it's actually underpowered, and that torque figure is pretty much matched with the Chery, so that helps it out a lot there. One initial concern I did have with this car was that the brake pedal felt a little bit sticky and like it was quite grabby, a little bit of a binary brakes are either on or off sort of situation, but once I tuned my foot into it a little bit, it was a bit better. It still could be probably a little bit more gradual though. The tyres, much like my hair during filming today, were a little bit let down by the fact that it started raining because I tried to take off from the lights not too long ago earlier actually, and these tyres don't seem to be quite up to the quality that some other tyres on medium-sized SUVs in this class can be. It spun the front wheels a fair bit, but once we were rolling, it wasn't like there was torque steer or sliding around corners or anything like that. A little bit of getting used to the tyres with a more gentle foot and it should be all good. Like its drivetrain, its suspension tune seems to also be a lot smoother and better tuned for Australia than the one in the Chery. On our semi-rural and sort of highway test route, the suspension wasn't really leaving the car feeling unsettled, it felt planted through corners, rough roads didn't really seem to bother it too much, and it didn't waft over sort of some of those larger bumps you get on the highway. Even sharp corners on things like potholes didn't really seem to jar into the cabin too much. Its steering is lighter than the Chery and possibly a little bit more vague as well, but it is actually a fairly accurate and direct steering rack, aside from the fact that if you're cornering at high speeds, you do need to give it a little bit more lock to get around some of those sharper bends. One thing that lets down the XUV700 is actually its reversing camera and the cameras that come up when you're indicating. They're really laggy and really low quality. They look a little bit like they're straight out of the early 2000s. And especially when you're actually rolling backwards, you kind of want the camera to be really on time. You don't want to bump something before you see it happen on the camera. Aside from that, and a couple of other small issues with the tech, like the fact that the driver display takes a little while to navigate, which can be a bit distracting when you're on the road, the Mahindra seems pretty well suited to Australian conditions, and that makes it the winner in the driving section of this comparison, convincingly. On paper, the Chery wins when it comes to fuel efficiency and has the Mahindra beat, but our test showed otherwise. Tiggo here comes with an 8.1 litres per 100 Ks claim, but we recorded 9.5 over a couple of hundred Ks of various driving, including highways, suburbs and semi-rural backroads. The Mahindra though, a claimed 8.3 litres per 100 Ks figure, actually turned out to be 8.0 flat in our testing on exactly the same roads at the same time over the same distance. Similarly, on paper, the Chery's got more safety credentials, the annoying lane keep assist aside. It has more advanced driver safety systems as standard over the Mahindra, which you need to get this higher spec to get. Its knee airbag and surround view camera are examples of features you only get on the AX7L in the Mahindra. On top of that, 10 airbags and a 5-star ANCAP rating tops the 7 airbags in the Mahindra with no ANCAP rating. The Mahindra's curtain airbag does cover the third row though, and it doesn't seem like it does in the Chery. Finally, what seems to be a decisive win for the Tiggo 8 is the post-purchase cost. Each car has a 7-year warranty, but Chery's is unlimited kilometers, while the Mahindra's warranty is only for up to 150,000. That still seems like plenty of distance and is more than the average person should cover over that time, but for some people 7 years is an awful lot of driving. Servicing is interesting, both have a 12-month interval, but Chery's on a 10,000 kilometer interval when it comes to distance and the Mahindra's is 15,000. Mahindra also only has 4 capped price services listed, along with a free 1-month or 1500 Ks check-in after the purchase. The capped price services average out at a hefty $445 though, while Chery has 7 years of capped price servicing and the average price is way lower, $298 per service, almost $150 less. When I crunched the numbers for these two cars, they came to the same total score under the CarsGuide rating system, but I reckon there's different things that are more important to different people, and these two cars kind of show that off. The Chery has more features and is more stylish, but I reckon the Mahindra is much better to drive on the road. Chery's ownership proposition is pretty good, but the Mahindra seems to be the more efficient car. The Chery seats are nicer, but the Mahindra has a sunroof. And while the Chery's lane keep assist is pretty annoying, Mahindra doesn't have an ANCAP score yet. For me personally, there are things about both these cars that would be deal breakers, but when it comes down to it, I reckon the Chery is more polished on the surface and the Mahindra is a bit more polished underneath, which shows on the road, and that's why it would be my pick. If you're thinking about buying one of these cars to save yourself some cash, just keep in mind that something more than a dealership test drive might be needed for you to make up your own mind.